Okay, so sorry guys, we're running a little bit behind, but we got 188 going now. And so what I was saying earlier is the 181 class is kind of ramping down, winding down, if you will, and this class is ramping up because I know that a lot of you guys were in both classes, and so you're not, most of the activities for the 181 class, the meter class are kind of wrapping up, but we're going to be starting some new activities for the scan tool class. And what you'll see is that, really the scan tool class and the meter class do work really well together. So with that, what are we doing tonight? Remember, like I said, whenever you're you're jumping into one of your classes on Canvas, you want to look at the class announcements, and that will help catch you up to speed. And I have on here, we're talking about more scan tool diagnostics. Let's also, I'm going to put it on student view, and let's go over to the class calendar and see what we have here. Okay, so by this point now, if you haven't got a scan tool, you need to get a scan tool. Now remember, I have scan tool interfaces for you at the school. And I have different ones from the generic ELM 327s to some Vice Car ones to a couple other styles. So I have a few varieties, some VPAC ones, but they're all the cell phone based tools. There's a few different apps that you can use. We're going to use the scanner app. And what you will see is in the next few weeks, you'll see more things pop up here on Fridays for you guys to do. Okay, so be looking at these class calendars because now you're going to see some activities popping up on there. The next activity will kind of follow with what we're going to talk about tonight, and that is a generic scan diagnostic procedure. Okay, so with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a new screen share. And I'm going to open up this presentation. So let me do that. Let's see. Hang on a sec. There it is. And let's get that going. New. There it is. Okay. So generic scan tool diagnostics. That is what we're going to talk about tonight, and I'm really trying to utilize our cell phone based or OBD2 generic scan tools. And so remember, OBD2 96 and newer. Keep in mind though, like your 96, 97s, even up to like 98, they're not quite, their systems aren't as advanced as when you get into the 2000s. So some things are a little hit or miss, but this will basically apply for 96 and newer cars, OBD2 cars. If you have a check engine light on, what are you going to do to try to diagnose what's wrong with that car? Okay, that's the procedure we're going to get through. Now, just a review of some things that we have already talked about in our, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 meetings that we've had this semester. And that is front door versus back door, right? Remember that your multimeter measures sensors and stuff directly, right? So that would be front door or live information. Scan data, anything you're pulling through here, is interpreted information. It's ones and zeros, right? That were sent from the computer to your diagnostic module, then sent to the cell phone or sent directly to your scan tool, but it's all processed data. So, sometimes processed data could lie to you, or it could be thrown astray. And even for things like codes, it doesn't necessarily mean if I set a code for that, that's got to be what's wrong. That's what the computer thinks is wrong. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's really wrong, right? So always keep in mind that the scan tool is pulling backdoor or processed information, okay? One of the other things we talked about is generic scan tools versus manufacturer specific. Like this guy right here is an example of the Toyota TechStream factory tool. Now, all the new factory tools are PC based, but a factory tool provides you with gobs of data and reprogramming capabilities. But it's also like that tool right there. When we bought them at this college, when they first came out, they were $8,500 a piece, each one. And then every year it's got to be updated. And so it gets very expensive having a factory tool. Okay. So in this class, we're utilizing inexpensive tools, interfaces that maybe cost you, let's say $30 to $80, right? And either cell phone apps that were free, or maybe they cost $5 or something like that. And I think, well, you're not going to be able to get as much data. What data you are going to get, that data is going to be emissions focused. Remember how we said that the goal with OBD2 was if you had a failure that would cause the emissions to increase, that's what's supposed to turn on the check engine light. And the original standard is if the emissions increased over 1.5 times the pass-fail standards, that would cause a check engine light to come on, okay? So that's the type of data you're typically gonna be able to pull with an interface like some of these that I have on the screen, okay? But although you don't get everything from the body control module and stuff like that, OBD2 generic data is not supposed to lie to you. It's not supposed to give you false data. If the coolant temperature sensor is unplugged, it's going to say 40 degrees below zero. It's not going to say, oh, it's at 180 degrees, okay? Because the laws and regulations of OBD2 don't allow it to do that. We're largely going to be limited to P0 codes, right? P0 are generic codes, but there's hundreds, if not thousands of generic codes now on a late model car. So there's still a lot of information I can get from the P0 codes alone. And of course, it does give us access to all the emissions monitors. So do we have everything with one of these cheap interfaces that a factory scan tool has? Not at all, but we can still diagnose a lot of problems with one of these basic interfaces and do quite a bit. Are we going to be able to pull data from the anti-lock brakes or the body control module? Probably not. It's mostly going to be stuff that's engine related. That's what we're going to access. But it's a good place. It's a good place to start. And there's still a lot of diagnosis that we can do with these tools. So that's what we're focusing on in this class, and that's definitely what we're going to be focusing on here tonight in this presentation. All right. So we took one week, and we took a few weeks and kind of went over the history of OBD2 and that type of stuff. We took one night and we really focused in on codes specifically, right? And we talked how there's two types of codes. There's type A codes and there's type B codes, okay? Type A codes were things like your misfire codes. And the idea was that a type A code should set right away. And when it sets that code, it turns on the check engine light. A type B code, on the other hand, would be something like, oh, your catalytic converter failed its efficiency, or your evap system has a leak. And so it would take a couple of trips where it failed in a row for a type B code to be set and then turn on the check engine light, right? First, it would set a pending code, then it would turn into a full-fledged code. And when it did that, that's when it would turn on the check engine light. And of course, to make it to have any code be set, you first have to meet the enable criteria, right? That's the conditions necessary for that code to be set. And we're going to look at that tonight with a quick case study. And then ultimately remember that the MIL functions, the check engine light, with another name for that is the MIL. It functions like when a code is set, you know, if it's a type A, the mill comes on right away. If it's a type B, it's going to lag a little bit until it sees consecutive failures in a row before it comes on. And then it's going to take multiple times for that monitor to pass for the check engine light automatically to turn off. Okay. So the goal is I only want to turn on the check engine light when there really is a problem, and I want to keep it on until the problem really goes away. That was the idea with OBD2. That's what they were shooting for. So we spent a whole night talking about codes, and we also talked about how if I have a P0 code, that's a generic code. So this P0301 is a misfire on cylinder number 1, and that doesn't matter if it's on an Audi or a Chevy or a Toyota. It's going to mean the same thing on every car, right? A P0420, catalyst system efficiency low. That's going to mean the same thing on a Ford versus a Chevy versus a Honda, right? And so that's another nice feature of OBD2 is we have these codes that are the same. Like we don't have to memorize a zillion definitions because we have that standardization. And that was huge because we just didn't have that in the days of OBD1. Okay, so remember when you pull codes, you always want to look for freeze frame data, right? Part of the rules with OBD2 is the first code that gets set is supposed to store a freeze frame. Now, what was that? That was the operating conditions that were going on when that first code was set. So here, this one was going 27 kilometers an hour. It was at 65 degrees C. The engine load was 82%. And so what that means is that usually is going to closely match what the enable criteria is to get that monitor to run. And that means that it's really important to help you diagnose the car. And here's the kicker, is it's great for verifying your repair, okay? It also gets totally blown out of the memory if you go in there and you say, oh, I'm just going to clear the codes, you lose all that information. Now, I also have a note here, don't forget to check the pending codes, right? So when I say pull codes, you always want to pull codes. And on some scanners, you pull codes, it pulls codes and pending codes all in the same spot. On other scanners, it might be a different mode to pull the codes. Technically, that's supposed to be OBD2 generic mode 7 is pull pending codes. So some scanners, it might be two different spots where you go pull the codes over here and pull pending codes over there, okay? So always pull codes and pending codes and look at your freeze frame and write all that stuff down, okay? Or screen save or something so that you have that information recorded. Okay, of course, scan data, each one of these data parameters here, each one of these is a PID or parameter ID, right? So engine RPM, coolant temp, throttle position, O2 sensor voltage. Each one of those things is a PID. And sometimes there's so many PIDs, it can be overwhelming, right? And we talked about how also if you're looking at everything, it can really slow the scanner down because it's not just the speed of your scanner, but it's also the speed of the computer that, you know, on the car, like how quickly can it send the information to your scanner, right? So sometimes this gets really bogged down, especially with some of the older networks like J1850. And we talked about making a custom data list. And when we did that, we look at the big 6 or the gray 8. And, you know, so what are those? What are the big 6 and the gray 8? What are the most important data parameters to look at? It's kind of your priority of your sensors, right? So I'll go ahead and put this in red. I'm going to say, okay, engine RPM. Okay, that's one of the most important ones. Okay, another one would be what is your load, which is usually going to be displayed either by my mass airflow or my manifold pressure, MAP. Oops. So those are a couple of big important ones. Let's keep going. Okay. Coolant temp, that's called ECT, and also throttle position, or TPS. All right. Those are a couple of big ones. And let me kind of keep moving down here. Okay, so now we know what's going on with the engine RPM, what's going on with how much air is entering the engine, or what the load of the engine is, and what's going on with the throttle position, right? And the RPM, the load, throttle position, those three guys should move together. They should move unison. When the numbers go up, they should all go up together. They should all go down together, right? So we have our coolant temp there. Then I like to look at our O2 sensors. So I'm going to say O2S, especially sensors 1, and then this might be a bank 1 and 2 if it's like a V6 engine. So you might need a couple of those guys. So now we're up to basically RPM, airflow, coolant temp, throttle position, and O2. So now we're up to 5 sensors there. But if I have 2 banks, now I'm up to 6. But there's a couple of the things I like to throw in there. I'll throw in the intake air temperature, or IAT. I'm also going to look at fuel trim. And for that, it's short-term fuel trim and long-term fuel trim. And this can kind of stretch out if I have, like, again, a bank 1 and a bank 2. So that's how I get up to like 8 different parameters. But from these things listed right here, the RPM, the airflow, the throttle position, the O2 sensors, and intake air, and ultimately the fuel trims, those parameters by themselves will tell me a great deal of information of how is the car driving, okay? Again, engine speed, RPM, throttle position, and airflow, those things should all move up and down together, okay? Those should move together. And of course, if I crack open the throttle, we expect the mixture to go rich. And so the O2 sensors should signal that as well. They should say, okay, I'm going rich. And then if I let off on the throttle, the mixture should go lean, and I should see those things all move together, okay? So when I have a drivability issue that the engine is running weird, it's running a certain way, that's what I'm looking at. Now, I might vary my custom data list based on what's, what codes I've set. Like if I have misfire codes, maybe I would look at all my misfire monitors or something. But if I just kind of want a general indication of how's the car running, those are the big 6 or great 8 parameters that I'm going to look at. Okay, moving right along. So how to set a custom data list, that varies by the scan tool. This particular scan tool, our Car Scanner Pro app, if you go to all sensors, you get everything on the car, and it can slow down the refresh rate. The easiest way to get a custom data list that I have found using this app is to go here and click on live data, and you basically can do 4 different parameters at once, and it graphs them over time. Now, it's not an oscilloscope. Remember, it's a scan data. It's a scanner. It's backdoor information. It's data stream. So it's basically graphing out the data over time. But I can look at 4 PIDs at once, and it does have a much faster refresh rate than I have when I'm over here, okay? So if I want to set up a custom data list on this tool, where do I go to do that? This live data function works the best for setting that. And what I do is I'll pick 4 of my important ones, and I'll set those together. Okay. And you'll see that I used that tonight. Okay. And we'll get more into that, and I'll demo it on a couple different tools. All right. So here is really where the rubber is going to meet the road, guys, is building a diagnostic process. Okay. Now, again, your scanner, it's another tool in your toolbox. It does not replace having a good multimeter. It doesn't replace a lab scope, but really it's made to be used in conjunction with those other tools. Okay. So we're going to do a diagnostic process here, and we're going to go through a case study that uses your scan tool, but still is going to end up using a meter in the process as well. Okay. So how do you attack this type of thing here? Well, what you want to do is go through these 8 steps here. Okay. Think of that great 8. Well, this is the great 8 steps to building a diagnostic. Okay. So whenever you have the customer bring you their car, I think very rarely did a customer bring me a car and say, "Oh, there's nothing wrong with it. I just want to give you money to look at." Right? There was always some type of complaint. So you get that complaint from the customer, and your very first step is to verify what that complaint is. Okay. What is the complaint? Now, for this class, our atypical complaint is that the check engine light or the mill is on, right? So if that amber mill is turned on, okay, well, that's pretty easy to verify. Is the check engine light on or not, right? But even if the light's turned off, it's a good idea for us to pull codes. So we verify the complaint. We're then going to pull codes. After you pull codes, remember you pull codes and the freeze frame, or pull codes and pending codes, and then look at your freeze frame data. Now notice that I keep saying record. What I mean by that is take a screenshot, or at least write these readings down, because you don't want to lose this information. Too often do I see people apply OBD1 strategies to the OBD2 cars. And if they got a car, the check engine light is on, they're like, "Oh, the check engine light's on." They clear the codes, they pull the codes and they clear them. And then after they pull the codes and clear them, they're like, they just give the car back to the customer. They're like, "I don't know, drive it around and we'll see what happens." Not only does it seem like you don't know what you're doing, but a lot of times your customer won't understand, and they'll think, "Oh, they fixed it." And then they get the car back and the check engine light comes back on. Okay. So pull the codes, pull the pending codes, record all that stuff, right? Save that data, pull the freeze frame, save that data. You're going to need it to verify your repairs when you're done. So the next thing I like to do is I like to look at the scan data. And what I ask myself is, does it support the codes? Does it match what I saw in the freeze frame? Does it support the code that's being set? And if it does, that's good. And if it doesn't, well, then that causes me to ask more questions. Why does it not support those codes, right? In the process of this, at this point, I'm usually going to have to be researching some service information. Now, I might actually do that maybe before I pull the scan data. If I don't know what the data should look like, I might be reviewing my service information first, but I'm going to be doing that on there as well. Okay. So review service information, then I'm going to do, my pinpoint test. Now my pinpoint test is where I'm actually using my multimeter or my lab scope, and measuring voltage drops and resistances and stuff. And ultimately that's what I'm going to need to do to figure out exactly what component I need to replace and do my repairs, right? So last but certainly not least, right, this is what it's all about is, hey, do those repairs. And then ultimately the very last thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I verify the repairs, that I really did truly fix the car, and the mill is not going to come back on when I give that car back to the customer. Step 8 here often gets skipped, and then the customer, you end up with an unhappy customer because you missed something. Okay. And cars are complicated. It's easy to to miss stuff. So do not skip step 8. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump through these 8 steps, right? Let's see. We're going to go through these 8 steps on a case study here and kind of pick our way through this. So with that, let's jump in. All right, so here's our vehicle. It's an older OBD2 vehicle, first year OBD2. So it's a little wonky. It doesn't have all the monitors and stuff, but nonetheless, so 96 Suburban, it's got the big block Chevrolet engine in there, 7.4 liter. And then it's got AT, AC, and AIR. These were things that you would, commonly have to tell the scan tool. It's got an automatic transmission. It has air conditioning. And what AIR stands for, it has an air injection system on it, which was only on the California models for those. But if you didn't tell the scanner all that information, it might not, have all the functions for looking at the air injection system. So on some scanners, you had to manually tell it, yeah, this car has air injection on it. Okay. So those are the options that it had. And of course, the complaint is that the mill or check engine light is on, right? And so whenever the mill is on, the way I like to look at that or think about that is like, okay, the dude in the dash is not happy, right? The computer's mad about something. What is he mad about? And that makes me think, okay, well, I want to know, what does it take to set this code, right? What is the enable criteria? That is going to be what's important to me to make the computer happy. If I make the computer happy, I'm going to be able to turn the mill off, and then the customer's going to be happy, right? So it's almost like the dude in the dash is my boss at this point, because he's turning on that mill, and it's my job to get that mill turned off. Okay, moving right along. So here we go. We verified the complaint. The mill is on. Here it is right here. And you can see we have some codes, right? So we pull codes. So verify the complaint, mill is on. So we pull codes and we check for pending codes. Now, on this little in this little scan tool app, where do I go to pull codes? Well, I'm going to go right here, diagnostic trouble codes. I don't have to go to a different spot to pull pending codes. They all get pulled from the same spot. And so this is my code here. I have a P0135, which is heated O2 sensor, bank 1, sensor 1, heater control circuit malfunction. I can click search on this thing. It'll pull up Google, which will basically tell me the same thing. It doesn't necessarily give me the specific information on how this 96 Suburban tells this fault or what its enable criteria is. For that, I'm going to have to look at the service information. Okay, but I know what the code is, and I'll screenshot that and I'll save it. I don't have any other pending codes, so far I'm looking good. All right. So verify the complaint. I know what I'm up against. So now I'm going to look at my freeze frame data, and there was enough data where it stretched out a couple of pages. So again, there's my DTC, the P0135, and it starts telling me what was going on. Well, I had about a little over 6% load. I was at 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So the engine wasn't ice cold. It was definitely in a warm-up phase. It wasn't at 200 degrees or 180 degrees. It's at 86. So it's like I started it up. I had ran it a little bit, but it was still warming up. Fuel trims don't seem too far out of whack, 0%. Kind of scroll down the page here. So fuel trim's not too far out of whack. Short trim, long-term fuel trim is looking pretty good as well. Now remember, when it comes to fuel trim, I'm going to change my color to green. 0 to plus or minus 10% is considered okay, is the green zone here, guys. So yeah, that's looking pretty good. The big thing is that, it's the engine was kind of cold at 86 degrees. I have a little bit of load on it at 6% right here. I'm running this thing at 1100 RPM, so it's just off idle. In fact, it looks like I was just accelerating 20 grams per second on the mass airflow. But basically, it's in drive. I'm taking off. I'm going 13 miles an hour. I'm just kind of accelerating off, and my engine is still cold, is what this told me. Okay. So the clue here is to test the O2 sensor heater, it must need to be seeing a warm up cycle. That's where the engine starts cold and then it gets to operating temperature, right? That must be part of the enable criteria. So what this means is if I cleared the code and I gave the customer back the car with the hot engine and they drove around all day, it probably would not reset this code again. In fact, it probably wouldn't reset maybe for a couple of days because it would wait for them to shut it off, let it cool down overnight. Then they would drive it the next day. It might set a pending code and it wouldn't set a full-fledged code for till the next time they had a warm-up cycle. So it would probably take several days before the check engine light would come back on because of the nature of this being a type B code and needing to see a warm-up cycle. Okay. All right. So again, save the freeze frame data, right? Save that information. If you just randomly clear the codes, you lose this data. So don't do that. If you're going to clear codes, at least save the freeze frame so you know how it was being operated when the code was set. That tells you a lot about the enable criteria. Now, from here, I'm jumping in and I'm reviewing the data. Does it support the code? Well, I set up a custom data list. In this case, I only looked at 3 different data PIDs. And these 3 PIDs, what I looked at here is I looked at my O2 sensors for bank 1 and bank 2, and they're both sensor 1. Why did I do that? Well, because what is the code? Well, the code is sensor 1, bank 1. Okay, so sensor 1, that's ahead of the catalytic converter, and it's on bank 1. So I'm going to compare the bank 1 sensor, which is setting a code, to the bank 2 sensor that's not setting a code. I want to see if one looks different than the other, right? And to give me a reference of what's going on with the engine, I threw up engine RPM, so I had something to compare it to. And I could have like maybe thrown throttle position on there. That would have been something nice to compare it to, but I didn't feel like it was necessary. So bank 1, I'm comparing it to bank 2. Both sensors are the first sensor, meaning that they're ahead of the catalytic converter. Okay, and so you can see I'm running the engine at idle. I rev it up to 1800. I let it slowly decel back to idle. And you can see that the sensors, oh, maybe this does look a little bit different. Now, this does take some knowledge of oxygen sensors. And this is where this class does not replace the engine performance class. Because an engine performance class, that's the class where we're going to teach you, well, how does an oxygen sensor work? What's going on the inside? What type of voltages are supposed to come off of that sucker? And in that class, what we tell you is that, okay, the O2 sensors on this car are zirconia sensors. And what they should do is they should vary between 0.9 volts and just right about 0 volts. And they should go back and forth, back and forth. And when they go up, this means it's running rich. And when it goes down, that means it's running lean. And it's supposed to go rich, lean, rich, lean, rich, lean. Now, if I open up the throttle, like I revved it up here, I would expect it to go rich. And then I held it there, so it should start cycling back and forth. When I let off on the throttle, I would expect it to go lean. And both of these sensors kind of did that. So from this data, I don't know if it supports the code. You know what? I'm going to do some research. So step 5, review some service information, right? And I have, maybe all data, ShopKey Pro, which is the same as Mitchell on Demand, right? Even a good Google search will kind of get you there. And so this is some data that I pulled off of ShopKey Pro, and it talks about how The vehicle control module, basically the computer, supplies 0.45 volts to the O2 sensor signal. And it talks about it going between 1 volt with rich, right? Like, so 0.9 would be like close to 1 volt to 0.1 volt with lean. So what I just told you, this thing told me that in the description. And it says, however, the O2 sensor produces no voltage and acts as an open circuit when its temperature is less than 600 degrees Fahrenheit. An open sensor circuit or cold sensor causes open loop operation. So here's, here's one of the key things to pull out of this is that O2 sensors need to be hot in order to work, 600 degrees, okay? If they're cold, they're not going to work very well, okay? And they produce somewhere between a 1 volt rich and 0 volt lean signal, and they should go back and forth like that, rich, lean, rich, lean, rich, lean, okay? And so they got to get hot, and we put them in the exhaust. So you do have heat from the exhaust system that should get them working, right? But this vehicle is setting a code for the O2 sensor heater. So what's going on there? Well, that heater is supposed to make the sensor warm up to 600 degrees faster, right? So right here where it says DTC will set when the following conditions are present. You know what that is? That's a fancy way to say this is the enable criteria right here, guys. So what is that enable criteria? Well, system voltage, meaning that you don't have a dead battery and your alternator is not overcharging the battery, okay? Mass airflow is less than 27 grams per second. So notice we were like at 20 grams per second. What that means is if you drive around and you're always at like wide open throttle and you're pulling like 90 grams per second or more all the time, it's not going to be able to set this code. Okay, so if you have too much load on the engine, it can't set this code. The engine needs to run longer than 2 seconds. Oh, coolant temperature is less than 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Remember that R code set and we were at 86 degrees. So remember, this is where I said it's going to need to see a cold engine, right? That's what it's telling us right there. Difference between the engine coolant temperature and the intake air temperature is less than 41 degrees. So what that means is these two things, they can't be too different. So for example, if the intake air, like outside, let's say it was 10 degrees below zero outside, so the intake air temperature is like 0 and the coolant temperature is at 80 degrees, that's still too much of a difference. It's not going to set that code, right? So what that also means is if I had a malfunctioning, let's say intake air temperature sensor, that would prevent this particular code from being set because I never meet the enable criteria. So you see how one thing's related to something else, right? And then it talks about elapsed time to obtain 3 to 6 volt is greater than a calculated value. So it doesn't tell us what that value is, but this is the key thing. What is the computer looking at? It is looking at time to activity. Okay, how long does it take for the O2 sensor to warm up and start working, start doing its thing? If it takes it too long for that O2 sensor to be active, that's when it's going to set this code. It doesn't tell me what the time range is. It doesn't mean that if it's over 60 seconds or it's over 35 seconds or it's over 5 minutes. I don't know what the time frame is, but there's some type of time frame programmed in the computer. And if it takes it too long to warm up, then it's going to set the code. All right, so we reviewed the service information. We know a little bit more how this works. And I could show you how you get that off of ShopKey Pro here in a minute. Let's clear out those drawings and we'll keep this thing moving. So back to the data, couple more screenshots here. Uh, O2 sensor, 1 versus 2. And I do see a little bit more cycling on sensor 2, but not a ton more. So I would say that the data, in my mind, it's a little bit inconclusive. I don't know. I can't just say based on this that, oh, the O2 sensor 1's definitely bad, because it is switching rich lean, rich lean, rich lean. It's maybe switching a little slower, but remember, this isn't its response to it's the code is about the heater. Well, if the engine is already hot, the exhaust system's already hot, if the O2 sensor itself's already hot, then it's going to be hard for me to see a difference, right? What I would literally have to do is catch this during a warm-up cycle, like start the engine up ice cold and watch the O2 sensors as the engine heated up to see like how quickly does O2 sensor for bank 2 get active versus how quickly does the O2 sensor from bank 1 get active. That's really what I had to do. And in these screenshots, both of them, the engine was already fully warmed at this point. So that's why I'm getting inconclusive data. Is at least that's what I think. So now what I'm going to do is clear out those drawings, and I need to change my screen share. And on this screen share, I just wanted to show you like, well, how did I get here? I'm going to change the vehicle and go back. I was looking, there it is right there. So from the home screen, I would type in my code. So I typed that in P0135, okay? And if I search that out, I get a P0135. I click that, and you can see that brought up this window. Now, throw that on the side. Okay, so from there, what would I do? How did I get this information that I shared with you in the presentation? I went right here in under OEM testing, and it told me the circuit description. It told me how does it work. Circuit description generally is telling you how does this thing work. Okay, not a lot of good pictures here, but then it's what do I need to set the code? Okay, so that's my enable criteria. And then it gives me this whole long process. It's just the flow chart of how do I diagnose this thing. So install the scan tool, monitor the O2 sensor voltage, look to see if it's switching. I did that. Then it says disconnect the O2 sensor, use a test light, see if it basically has voltage at the O2 sensor. And so then it has you basically test to see, do I have power and ground at the O2 sensor? If I do, it says basically throw a new sensor on. Is essentially what you have. Notice that there's also a wiring diagram. So there's that wiring diagram right there. I'm going to add that in there. And then there's some other things that are here. For example, if I close that out, I'm going to go to specifications and notice that I have O2 sensor and how much to torque it down. But if I go to, I don't see it there. Okay, oxygen sensor. I was hoping that it would give me a resistance spec. Hang on. On operation. It tells me the same thing I had before. All right, let's see. OEM testing. I would love to know on the heater, how much resistance the heater should have. There we go, right there. So if I look at this right here, it says, hey, if I test the heating element of the O2 sensor with my ohm meter, it should have somewhere between 3.5 to 14 ohms. Okay, so I could do a bench test of the heater element as well. Okay, so that's a bunch of the information I got off the shop key. You might be able to pull that off of Google. Might be kind of hit or miss. Remember, in this class, you guys have my logins and passwords to shop key, so you guys can look that information up. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to change my screen share back to our presentation. We're going to finish this thing out. Okay, so data kind of inconclusive, but I wasn't looking at it at the right time. I was looking at it with everything hot, and I need to look at it when it's cold is what I really need to do. But I know enough to pinpoint test it now, right? So yeah, the scan data is inconclusive, but what I could do is the factory procedure talked about, hey, you know, if you look at the wiring diagram, what do you have here? And this is where this class here, this 188 class, really crosses over to the meter class, because now you look at this info and you go, okay, well, I have my O2 sensor, and then I have my O2 sensor heater. And so how's this circuit work? Well, power comes from the ignition switch. It goes through this fuse. It might go to the other O2 sensor heaters, but it comes in through this pink wire. And then from there, it goes through the heating element. And ultimately, it then goes to ground, right? So what this is telling me is I should have 12 volts here and 0 volts there. Or if I put my meter here, I'm going to draw, here is my bright green school meter. If I plug them in there, I put one lead right there and another lead right there, I should measure 12 volts going to my O2 sensor heater. In the factory flow chart, they asked us to use a test light for that, which seems kind of weird, but they wanted to put a little load on the circuit, I guess. So the O2 sensor heater element should have 12 volts going there. So I could disconnect the O2 sensor and I can measure, hey, do I have 12 volts right there? If I do, it's looking like my circuit's okay, and the problem is my sensor. Now you guys might be wondering, well, what's going on for this part of the circuit? It kind of shows this thing as like a variable resistor, and it talks about high and low. It's not really a variable resistor. It's a zirconia sensor. It's a voltage generator, but basically it's trying to show you that, hey, this thing's going to have a varying voltage signal on those wires. And the tan wire is like the ground, and the purple wire here, that purple wire essentially is your signal wire. And that was common to all the GMs. The purple wire would be the signal wire on the oxygen sensor. Even back in the day when you had a one wire O2 sensor, the one wire that would be on there would be a purple wire. So that's the O2 sensor signal wire. So if I was setting this code, I could go to the sensor, and if I had a good power and ground there, and so the wiring looked good, and I'm getting this code, more than likely it's the sensor element that itself has failed, right? But what other tests could I do? I could measure the resistance of my heater element, right? So clear out these drawings, and we go through there, and we do that. Remember, there's that diagram again, and here's a picture. That's actually, that picture there is from Toyota, but it's asking you to do the same thing. And if I'm measuring 235 ohms of resistance there, that's obviously too much resistance. It's not between, 3.5 ohms to 14. So that would basically tell me, oh, the heater element has burned up, or it has high resistance. And that would make sense why it would take too long for the O2 sensor to heat up and set this code. And then I could, so that's my pinpoint test, right? So I pinpointed it. Yes, I have a defective oxygen sensor, bank 1, sensor 1. From there, I can make the repair, right? Change out that O2 sensor. Keep in mind that they make special O2 sensor sockets. They have this cut in the side so you can get the wires in and out of there without damage. And unfortunately, like this is where we generally make our money in the industry. It's actually putting parts on the car, right? A lot of the work, I feel like all the heavy lifting is on the diagnosis side. The money-making side is throwing the parts on, okay? Keep in mind that these things get really stuck in the exhaust system. So you might have to hit it with PV blast and let it soak and let the exhaust system cool all the way down. And some of these, like the air-fuel ratio sensors on RAV4s, you pretty much, okay, I'm gonna have to replace the whole exhaust manifold because they would just weld themselves in there. My other tip on oxygen sensors is always get a direct fit sensor. Don't get one that you got to splice the wires on. It's a 0 to 1 volt signal, 0 to 1 volts. Any little resistance in that and those wires is going to throw off your sensor signals and cause a bunch of codes. So don't use any like generic O2 sensors that you got to like, butt connector together. That's going to be nothing but problems. I threw a picture up here of that O2 sensor heating element. You can see the zirconium sensor tip, the heater contact on the inside. The idea is that it gets the sensor up to 600 degrees and working faster with having that heater element in there, okay? So you make the repairs. You're not done though, because remember, step eight is always verify the repairs, right? Go for that test drive. But it's not just doing a generic test drive, right? It's not just a generic test drive. You're going to drive it in such a way that you meet the enable criteria and you perform a trip. Now, if you guys have forgotten what is a trip, well, in OBD2 terms, a trip in OBD2 is that you've started the car, so it's a key on engine run cycle where then you meet the enable criteria. The computer runs its monitor, it runs its diagnostic test. It says, hey, how's that O2 sensor heater doing? And because it looks at its time to activity, right? And then it tests it out. And then you shut the car off. And then you're going to go on there, key on engine off, and you're going to check for codes. And here's what's key is you're also going to check for pending codes. And if you don't have any codes, and more importantly, you don't have any pending codes, because it's going to be a type B, so it's likely you set a pending code first, then you can feel pretty good that, yes, I have fixed the problem and I'm ready to give this car back to the customer, okay? This is the thing that so many people, they don't do this. They clear the codes, they don't drive the car, they give back the customer, and if you missed anything, the check engine light's going to come back on and you're going to have an unhappy customer that comes back to you. Now think about this. This is going to be a pain in the butt, because in this car, you could fix the problem today on Thursday, but you can't give the customer back the car today. You got to wait till Friday. You got to wait till the car to cool down and then to start the car and drive it around and look at the data and make sure it runs that monitor, and then check for codes and pending codes. Make sure that you have met the enable criteria, that you've done that warm-up cycle. That's what it needs. It needs a warm-up cycle where you're not giving it too much throttle, right? And so all that stuff that we looked at on that chart, where the intake air temperature and the coolant temp were, they weren't more than 40 degrees apart. The coolant temperature was less than 90. The airflow was less than 20%. So anyways, do all that. Then if there's no codes or pending codes, you're looking good. And I do have on here, you could also review mode 6. Now, what is mode 6? Mode 6 is your test results for non-continuous monitors. Basically, mode 6 can tell you not only did it pass its test, but how well did it pass its test? Did it pass it with an A plus, or did it pass it with a C minus? And we'll talk about that more in future classes. Mode 6 cut is kind of one of those more advanced features of OBD2. That's pretty cool. And for things like testing catalyst efficiency, it's a really good way to go. It can let you know, hey, this catalytic converter is getting close to failing before it's even set a code yet, right? It's a way for you to kind of see what's going on over time. So we'll get into mode 6 more in the future. If you've done all these things correctly, right? Verified the complaint, okay? Pulled the codes, looked at your freeze frame data, recorded that, you know, looked at, does the scan data match that? Do your pinpoint test, do good repairs, and verify those repairs. If you do all that stuff right, guys, at the end of this thing, you end up with a happy customer. And so that's why I say, you know, verified repairs equal happy customers, because you can give them the car and you have a good amount of confidence that that car's gonna, the check engine light's gonna stay off, and everything's gonna be good. Now, you know, is it 100%? No, I mean, there's always wiggle room, right? Unless you did a full drive cycle on it, it'd be hard to know for sure. Just like how you saw tonight, how the intake air temperature sensor could affect this monitor from running. You might fix one problem, which allows a different monitor to run later that detects a different problem. I mean, that's just the reality. It's never going to be 100%, but if you've saved all your information, you know, I would save all that stuff digitally and attach to that customer's records. So even if the customer did come back and say, hey, the check engine light's on again, if you pull the codes and now it's different codes, it's like, well, you know what? These were the codes when I looked at the car and I did fix that issue. Now there's some other stuff wrong with the car, right? Like, it also helps you cover yourself, so you know what you've done and what problems you fixed on the car. So nothing's ever 100%. I've had that happen multiple times where I fixed one thing on the car, but then that led me to realize that there was a problem with something else, but you couldn't see that for the other thing. Anyways, you do everything that you can do within a reasonable amount of time to make sure that you've kind of Bobby Fischered this thing out, right? Bobby Fischer was a famous chess champion that could see so many moves ahead, right? You try to see as many moves as you can ahead realistically with the amount of time that you have. And if you go for a good test drive where you've met the enable criteria, at least for the code or codes that you were dealing with, and then you've checked for codes and pending codes, you've kind of done your due diligence that you have fixed the car, and you should have a happy customer like that guy right there. So that's it. That's the steps. That's the procedures. I'm going to change that that screen share, and I'm just going to throw it up on the screen again. Verify the complaint, which means like, yeah, okay, I see the mill's on. Pull codes, save those, right? Record them. Pull this freeze frame data, save that. Also check for pending codes. Look at your scan data. Does it support those codes? Then you're at this point, you're going to have to get some service information and make sure that all gets put together. Then that brings you to your pinpoint tests. So you actually have to know how to do those. And that's where your knowledge comes in about the multimeter class. Then when you figured out all that stuff, now you can do those repairs. And hopefully now you're doing pinpoint repairs. You're not doing what we call shotgun repairs, where you're just replacing all kinds of stuff. Oh, I think it needs fuel injectors, a computer, an oxygen sensor, and a coolant tank, right? That's a shotgun repair. You're just throwing everything but the kitchen sink on this thing. Try to pinpoint repair that thing and fix actually what's defective, and not just everything underneath the hood, and then verify your repairs. That's how you do proper diagnosis. That's kind of what we're hoping for you to get out of this class. And there's a lot of that you can do even with that generic scan tool. All right. Again, I'll show you some tips in other classes of how you can do some shortcuts with just the scan tool. but that gets you going. So like I said a few weeks ago, what I want to do, and I did get a few screenshots from some folks about some codes that they were pulling, is I want you to send me some codes and some data, and we'll use your information to build a case study on, okay? And I think that will be pretty rewarding. Other things that we're going to talk about in the classes, we are going to talk about mode 6, and then we're going to do some stuff with like the volumetric efficiency calculator and a few other things to leverage, like how much can I leverage generic data to see what's going on with this vehicle. Okay, so anyways, if at the end of the class you could do these steps, these 8 steps that are on the screen, I would feel really awesome about that. And if you know where to go, how to pull trouble codes and how to look at scan data, and maybe make a custom data list, we'll talk about that as well. That will get you guys going the right direction. And when you get the engine performance class, or even if you're diagnosing a problem on your own vehicle, you're going to be real dialed in and ready to attack those problems. So before I let you go tonight, do you guys have any questions for me? Any questions out there? Okay, keep in mind to look at your class calendars, check for announcements, because you'll see stuff popping up now in the class as we come up for some activities and assignments for you to do. Okay, all right, have a great week, have an awesome weekend. Get yourself a scan tool if you don't already have one, and start pulling some codes and some data, and we'll make a case study out of it. Okay guys, bye for now. Take care, everybody.